Hey everybody, Robot here from Vespa Motorsport and scooterwest.com here in San Diego, California. So if you follow the channel, a couple years ago I got this 2009, I think it is, GTS 250. I've been riding around, I put like 1700 miles on it over the last 2 years. And if you look at those prior videos, it's called Robot's Winter Project. Well, it's almost summer 2024 here. I'm gonna actually start working on my winter project again. So, kind of fixed up mechanically in those past videos. Well, the next thing, I'm tired of having something that's pretty much a tetanus shot on the right-hand side. So, I have a replacement frame that's just has a lot of shelf dust and dings on it, but much better condition than this frame. It maybe is possible to fix this up. It would take a tremendous amount of hammer and dolly work, but you know, if you're looking for a frame, they're generally like around 2,000 bucks, you know, for a new frame. So kind of think of your time. Do you want to spend 40 hours doing all the body work to a frame? Or do you want to just start fresh? Well, I have the opportunity to start fresh, so I'm gonna strip this down today, show you how to dismantle a GTS all the way down to the bare parts, and pretty much prep it as if you're gonna do paint and body work on it. And depending on how severe the damage is, say if I was just doing the cowls, I would just detrim just the back of the scooter and remove the floorboard, and a body shop can do their magic on the sheet metal and repaint it and put it back together. But this one, I'm gonna pull the fork, I'm gonna do everything on it. And believe it or not, it goes pretty quick. So enough of me talking, let's get started. So before we even get started, the most important part about dismantling a Vespa is being organized. And there's several ways to do that. Obviously, just having a box with everything in it, and everything from the smallest screw to the largest body panel, that's not gonna be your solution. But you wanna have a couple different boxes, or even better yet, something like a plastic tote bin, a couple of them. And you wanna have an assortment of Ziploc bags, you know, everything from like little ones to really large ones to put like sub-assemblies in. Say you take the throttle assembly apart and you can put that all in one bag. And sometimes I even put smaller bags inside of a larger bag, and then just have yourself a large Sharpie to write on the bag what it is, you know, screws for the handlebar covers, or screws for the floorboard, or whatever. So kind of along the way, I'll just be staying organized, putting the small parts in bags. I got these nice bubble wrap things. These are actually what new body work for a Vespa comes in, so I tend to save them. There's all sorts of different sizes, but you know, say if I took the mirrors off, I could put a mirror in and then fold it up. Of course, you can buy bubble wrap, but when you got stuff just sitting around, that's even better. So I'll start by taking the handlebars apart. Mirrors are pretty easy to do. Just spin them off on these. They're both just standard threads. And probably even take the top case and racks off. Just get those out of the way. And I got that nice rack on there. Have a 4mm Allen key. And I'll try to use power tools to kind of make the job more efficient. You do have to be careful, you know, that screw is a little tight. Really easy to strip if you just go to town with a oops. So getting the accessories out of the way, that always is probably, I would say, maybe your first step. The mirrors, accessories, all that kind of stuff. So you got hardware. We're gonna unthread those. Put all of this hardware in a bag. All right, there's some stuff I'll try to make little piles of certain things I want to refurbish. Like this badge, I'm just going to replace this probably when I reassemble it. But this little grill is still in good shape, just needs to be cleaned up. So I'll make like a bag of all the little trim pieces I want to save, you know, clean up, maybe reuse. Probably that badge out of the way. And then there's going to be items such as this horn cover that I'm going to want to repaint. So I'll make a bag of, or more like a box of all the parts that I'm going to use for to go out to paint. It's got this little light right here. You could disconnect the connector, but you could also just pull the light right out of there. That was only found on the early, the 250s. And you got that little grill here. And I'm just using a power screwdriver. And another thing you want to keep in mind, you see how there's dirt on the back side of this, this cover here. A lot of times I'll pressure wash all the parts. I'll try not to drop the parts like I'm doing there, but you want to pressure wash these, get them really clean so they're just prepared for the body shop. So since I'm replacing the frame, there's a lot of parts that I'm going to completely take off. Like these two brackets right here, they're just specific for the front rack. But once I get things further apart, I'll have easier access to get those out of the way. So I'll continue bagging those parts with that setup there. Probably the next thing I want to take off is the rear rack and top case. That's pretty self-explanatory and easy to do, but we're going to dismantle the handlebar covers because the glove box comes off much easier once you get the handlebar covers out of the way. Under here, you got a single Phillips screw, and I'm putting my finger under there so I don't lose the screw. It's got a little rust too. I'll probably replace that. Take a number 1 Phillips screwdriver, and there's these small screws on each side. They actually, even on the 24 Vespas, they still have a similar setup with the real small screws. And even though these master cylinder reservoir covers are in place, you can actually get the handlebar covers out of there even with them in place. So it's got to kind of lift up a little bit. And this has got the aftermarket headlight in there, so it's kind of got a different arrangement. You got the 3-prong connector for the headlight itself, and there's also a running light. We'll go ahead and separate all these parts because I want to paint all these individual parts here, bag them up. So we'll go ahead and take the rear half of the handlebar covers off. They have the throttle cable right here zip tied to the speedometer cluster. That's just what they did on the early ones. Sometimes I'll make a little hash marks, a pair of hash marks, just as a reminder. That's where a zip tie resided. So go ahead and disconnect the mechanical speedometer cable. And pretty much anything that's before 2015 would have a mechanical speedometer cable. The Primaveras and Sprints, the GTS 300 with the ABS starting in 2015, it's all electronic. So it's kind of old school that they got the mechanical cable, much like the older Vespas. The Vespa GTV in the Safe Journey is the exception. They had a mechanical cable all the way up to 2022. You have a couple screws that hold the handlebars, or the rear plastic half to the handlebars. And there are these little short grub screws here. Just gonna get those all out of the way. And keep in mind there's shorter ones that go down. So you may want to make a note that the lower screws are shorter. On Vespa LXs, they actually had longer and shorter ones. But if you put them in the wrong spots, they damage the painted surface. So, you know, it's pretty critical to get your fasteners back in the correct spot. So the lower ones are the short ones there. So it's kind of, you can see it's getting loose right there. Had that apart before. And continue adding that to my pile of the handlebar hardware. So go ahead and pull that away. So you have several connectors here. Got your ignition kill. I did replace all these buttons maybe a year and a half ago. These GTS's 250s have a single connector for the partially digital speedometer. Sometimes you might have difficulty popping that connector, so you can just get back there and there's a tab. If you're familiar with connectors on like modern automobiles, they usually all have lock-in tabs, and you may want to just rock the connector until it pulls out. The GT200s and the GTS 300s starting in 2010, they went to more of an old school style speedometer that has like a printed circuit board on the backside. The connectors are very fragile on those. You could probably look at some of my prior videos when I take those apart. But at this point, I get all the switches out of here, which is pretty easy, and remove the speedometer and the headlight. All right, so we'll get the speedometer out of here. Four screws generally is what holds the speedometer. They're kind of these like coarse threaded screws. Again, if you want to be extra cautious, you can even individually bag those 4 screws. One thing to keep in mind, there's a little bit of cracking on the top of this lens just because of the age. On many of the speedometers, not all of them, you can actually order as a replacement spare part a replacement lens. It really makes them look nice. Maybe even go the extra mile, scrape the paint on that needle and repaint it red on the backside so it looks really, really nice. I always like kind of restoring speedometers. They're kind of like watch building, but it really makes them look nice because as an operator of the scooters, that's one thing you look down at. So keep that in mind. The switches, they're all fresh, so we're gonna go ahead and save those. I'll bag those all up. They have little locking plastic tabs that hold them in place, and I'm using a small flat blade screwdriver to release those little tabs. And you kind of just rock the switch out of this plastic handlebar cover. And the same goes on the other side here, except for the turn signal switch is unique. It does have screws that hold it in place. And sometimes from age, the plastic will actually be cracked. So you may want to, this may be the time to replace this whole piece of plastic. You know, keep in mind, you know, this scooter I'm fixing up is nearly 15 years old. Sometimes the plastic parts get a little brittle, so you pull the 2 screws out. Make sure those 2 bosses are in good shape. I see a little crack on this one. I might try to reinforce it with some epoxy. Same with these ones down here. You know, if there's any cracks in this plastic, why would you want to paint like a piece that's damaged? But one thing to keep in mind, if you buy an unpainted piece, it's probably not going to match up as well. So you want to check the fitment of all these items before you send them out to paint. Obviously, I know these fit together really good, but I have seen situations where you paint something and it just doesn't quite line up with the old part, and it's just, you know, the tooling is, you know, a little different. These decals, they come right off. Even after all these years, it comes off no problem. So get that out of the way. Definitely don't want to mask around that decal. The headlight, normally they have large Phillips screws. It's got this aftermarket LED headlight. So I'm using, 3mm Allens. And obviously I'm going to reuse the headlight. So we put it. So got my little bucket of parts right there. Headlight just pops out, and you got these master cylinder reservoir covers. Again, these are typically really fragile on this age of scooter. So I'm actually just using the Allen by hand here. Take those out. And those tabs are still in good shape. You could paint it with this little Tinnerman clip, but I'm gonna actually pull these out really carefully. Let's try that again. And some of that hardware, this one, yeah, it's still in good shape. Tinnerman clip's got a little bit of rust. Just be very careful, kind of rock it out of the way so you don't break the tang. Again, oftentimes these are broken right off, but short of just cleaning this part, it's pretty much, somebody will Scotch-Brite it and it's ready for repaint. I'm gonna probably change the color. I mean, it's not in that bad a shape, but put that in my box of all the parts I'm gonna repaint along with these little reservoir covers. All right. So some of the pieces I wanna protect, like my mirrors, I'm gonna reuse those. I'll put them in a large piece of bubble wrap, like this bag here, and I'll kind of separate them. Obviously you can't see what I'm doing back there. And you kind of roll the bag, put an extra layer of bubble wrap, and I'll put some other associated parts such as this headlight. Not gonna really mess with that right now. The speedometer, I might come back and do a new lens on it, but I'll pretty much put all these back. You could, it's all stable in here and all protected, and I can even mark on there, that's the handlebars as well, or the parts. So now I got this nice little protected package, because if I just threw those in a bin, you'd be rattling around, you'd be scratching them up. Not really the best situation. All right, so next we're gonna go ahead and get the seat, the floorboard, the glove box all out of the way. Pull the underseat bucket, 10 millimeter. And oftentimes I'll just put the hardware in that, kind of set the seat with the bucket, probably reupholster the seat. All right, so go ahead, get the floor mat off. See, that's pretty chalky looking. I'll probably refurbish all these parts. I'm not gonna replace them, but it is possible. You can see it doesn't quite look new anymore. So you got 4 screws for that battery mat right there. And while I'm here, might as well get the floor strips out. And again, I'll refurbish these as well. I'm kind of just carefully using my fingers. You don't want to pull too much on these because they will tear. And if you're having a little difficulty, you could actually get a little flat blade screwdriver under there and prise up on them. But you can kind of see how they work. See all that dirt under there. And I figured might as well get these out of the way, just because to remove the floorboard, you got to get the outer ones out. Some screws that are located under there. And if you did ever want to buy new floor strips, they are sold as the whole set. They pretty much were unchanged until just recently. And even the old ones, like you could buy the blue Yacht Club ones and they'll fit a brand new 2024 Vespa. I'll do the same on the other side. And I was telling you about some screws that are located under here. And they're nearly identical to the battery cover, a little bit longer screws. And while you're at it, you pull these little clips off. And you'll find these throughout the Vespa. They use those little chairman clips here. Probably not a bad idea now to disconnect one of the battery terminals. I always start with the negative there. Get the battery we'll just get it out of the way. Disconnect the positive. And this is a later GTS 250 where they have equal length battery terminals. The early ones had two different lengths, and they were intended to be used with a conventional lead acid battery where you got to top off the fluids. They're kind of a pain in the butt to top off, but they did change that to the better sealed design later. So I'm kind of putting all the pieces right there in the floorboard. I'll probably put those all in one bag. Pull my battery out. I also have a battery tray in there. So make sure that stays. I see a lot of scooters come through here with no battery tray. And I'm going to go ahead and do the same with the right floorboard as well here. All right, so we kind of got the floorboard pretty far along. It kind of started with the battery. Now we're going to get the glove box. Go ahead and open the door, and you can see this door is all loose. We'll deal with that. Get these two knee pad things out of the way. And these are gonna have longer screws that don't have a point on them. So, and usually what I'll do is I'll take this little cover, start putting the hardware in it, and I'll probably get more organized and bag it up. So this has our optional, the Scooter West PP4 and the USB charger jack in there that I added. So I'll just leave that all together for right now. And in both corners, you should find short little screws. I don't think this glove box has all the screws because this is pretty crashed up. So these lower left and right corners have long pointy screws. And then there's, again, little short screws in the center here. And they're actually not even attached to anything right now because everything's all crashed up. I actually got the little plastic nut that they thread into. And this side doesn't have anything. There's gonna be a single large screw in the middle, right next to the glove box latch. You can see the whole glove box kind of pulling away. And right up front, underneath the horn cover, there's gonna be a pair of screws. Only one is remaining on this scooter. And kind of see that so at this point, pull the keys out. You can get the glove box out of here. Gotta take the radiator cap off. You could use the Scooter West tool SN to remove this. Let's get that cap out of the way. And we'll just lift this glove box. And it comes off really easy when you don't have the handlebar covers in the way. Several connectors. You got the auxiliary connector. You have this little seat pop button right here. Just pull that connector right there. And we have the manual seat release. Come back to that. I do have the fuse holder, and on the top there's a little tab. You want to lift that little tab in the center. It's probably right in the dead center, and you could pull the fuse block right out of the glove box. And the later ones, they had an ABS pump and a little bit different setup. But right here is where there's a little tab that engages with the fuse block. And the last thing that's holding this glove box on is this seat pop. You want to have a needle nose handy. And we'll go ahead and pull this little cable barrel out. Just pull the cable and it kind of dislodges that little barrel right there. And typically you could push this right through. Sometimes it won't come through and you may just need to pull it from the back side very carefully. They are a little on the fragile side. There we go. So you can see it kind of gave it a little squeeze and it separated. And at this point, the glove box is separated from the body of the scooter here. There's several things that we're going to do to this glove box. Remember I said the glove box door is loose? It's because these little brackets right here are loose. I'm going to take the latch out. I'm going to take these little radiator grills. You could replace those with either ones from a later model. You can see this is blown out where the screw boss normally is. There's supposed to be a screw boss on this side. It may be possible to salvage this and fabricate something. Kind of come back to it. Lots of corrosion inside this seat pop button, so I'll probably throw that out, start with a new one. The thing with these earlier GTS is there's always electricity going to that button, so it tends to corrode them. On the later models, you have to have the key in the ignition and turn to the first position to energize the seat pop, or they have the remote that comes with them as well. Several little clips. You got little clips that will pull right out like that. You can see the paint's kind of detaching from this, so if you're going to paint it, you want to make sure that's all flaked off. All right, so yeah, I'll just get started with the process of dismantling this glove box. So you got the bag hook. A lot of people want to replace that with a metal one. And I'll probably do the same, put something a little nicer there. So this is the time to access it. It separates just like that. Get the screw out of here. And you may just want to stay organized, partly thread these screws back in place. The seat pop button, just like those buttons on the handlebar, you just kind of squeeze this tabs. You can do with the needle nose, even a small flat blade screwdriver. Pop that out. You can see it's kind of worn, the Tampo graphics or silkscreen graphics on the front. Definitely worth replacing that. You have in here is the latch for the seat pop. There's a little spring right here, and I'm gonna go ahead, while I got the needle nose, I'm gonna shift that spring to the center and dislodge that little piece. You have the radiator grills. They use these small little screws, little gold screws here. And I'm still keeping these all with all the hardware that I have for the glove box. And those just pop right out like that. And we'll flip the glove box off. You can buy these little heat protectors. This is a separate part, but if you're painting a scooter, you could leave them in place. There's one that has like a little bit more of a indent for the fan motor. These little brackets right here that are loose right now, they have little screws that hold them in place. Get those out of the way because we're gonna go ahead and pull the glove box door. A lot of times I'll just partly dismantle the glove box and reach back there with a small stubby screwdriver and tighten up the the glove box door. There is a little cable clamp that's stuck to the top of the glove box there. This last little clip, and then we're flipping it over here. And here's an example. There's a reason there's no screw in that is this clip is blown out. So you may want to buy a new clip. I think it's part number CM017410, I think it is, if I recall, for that clip. Go and open the glove box. You could do that by pushing a little latch. Open, get my finger in there. It's gonna be a little difficult with the hinges. And at this point, we carefully pull the door out. You know, now the hinges are out there. Sometimes it's a little easier if you get this little tray out of here, and I'll get a flat screwdriver in there, go on each side, and they have these little locking tabs, kind of hold it in place. Pulls right out. And then there's also a little rubber mat, so both those pieces just pull right out. There's a lot of toothpicks. I didn't leave those in there, so that's some previous owners, some Allen keys. I did leave those. You see these decals in here? The warning decals, you know, you can remove those. But these certification decals, you can't really get those as replacements. So sometimes when you register the scooter in a different state, they may want to see those decals. So you may want to mask those. They're not going to easily remove, I can tell you that. One other thing is the glove box door does come off easier if you take the reinforcement plate off, but it is possible to get it out of here. You know, this thing stiffens the plastic glove box. But once you get one side out, then it comes right out really easy. And we'll dismantle this a little further. But next we're gonna move on to these latch. You know, I did pop that little spring out for that manual seat release latch. There's a couple tools left in here. Normally they're in a bag, but that's the tool holder. And I don't know what this even says. Only use parts that are approved for the scooter, it says. But all these kind of decals, if they don't remove as easy as they are for me, you could always take a heat gun to them and take these decals out of here. This one up here just says don't open the radiator cap when it's hot. We do have these decals available as spare parts. They're pretty inexpensive if you do want to make your scooter all that much more original. I don't want these decals. I prefer to paint all the parts with the exception of those, I guess you call them the federal emissions labels, so I'll leave those alone. I'll come back to that. So this little hinge right here, it's got a little pin, and I'm gonna push from the inside of the glove box, just using nail nose right here. And you push the pin, it's got a part that's knurled on it, and it's got a lot of rust on it. I want to clean that off or just replace the pin. That doesn't help the rust in there. I haven't really seen one too rusty like that before. And keep that with that. And then there's also the little spring in here. Don't want to lose that spring. So there's all the pieces for the manual seat pop. The next thing we're going to dismantle is this glove box latch. And I think the easiest way to push that is right from this side. There we go. So again, just like that seat release, same style pin. Try not to pinch my, well, not as much rust on this one. Could reuse these, like wire brush them, put a little grease on them. And then we'll pull the latch off, and there's how that spring sits. I'm not going to mess with the spring, but it's like a dual action spring. It pops the door open. It also puts tension on this this little latch here. So there's a gasket for the glove box. You can reuse that or replace it. And generally it's just start prying it, and then you just pull it right out. There's one last thing that we want to do, with the exception of that sticker that I'll come back to. This decal right here has the VIN number. You could take a 1/8 inch or a 3mm drill bits and drill these pot rivets out. And I'll go ahead and remove that, and you could just use standard pot rivets to put that back in place. So I still need to determine if I'm going to fix this up. Probably will, and then just reinstall it. The rest of the glove box is still in good shape. It's got a couple chips in it and some flaking paint. Definitely get that all cleaned up before we put a new coat of paint. But you know, for example, there's paint flaking right here. I'm just taking it off with my nail. You don't want to put paint over that, because the new paint won't really adhere to that little spot. So a lot of prep that you need to do before you paint these parts. So before you paint the door, the little badge comes off, and we do have all those badges available as replacement parts. You can look them up. Maybe you can put a different badge, like a 300 badge, even though your scooter's a 250, but in reality they're pretty close to the same scooter. So they're all these same little screws. And again, really important that you keep the same screws, because if I put a longer screw in place, it will go right through the front or the back side of the glove box. And you know, for instance, if I use this screw, if I bottom that out, that's gonna be too long, and you'll end up with a little dent in your freshly painted glove box door. So keep that in mind. Real critical on the fasteners, like I've said a couple times. These ones are a little bit longer ones, same ones that they use for the little louver radiator grills. This little latch, it goes kind of down like that, not up like this. So obviously when I assemble it, I'll show the correct position. So this part, with the exception of the badges just usually peel right off really easy. Again, I'll use like a plastic scraper, get that adhesive. There's actually a wheel that we have on a drill that's like almost like the same material as like a really hard pencil eraser, and it will take adhesive off. You could also use like Ugon or anything, you know, a lightweight solvent. These badges get a little crispy over time. Like the scooters definitely look nice and fresh when you have a whole set of new badges. So I'll set those aside. That's pretty much all I want to do for right now on the glove box. You could take these decals off. You could even paint this, make it look pretty cool. I might do that just to do something a little different. It's got a little rust on it. It's a sheet metal part, so it'd be pretty cool to paint. All right, so we're gonna get the glove box off. First, you wanna get these side skirts off. I probably am gonna replace both of them. The other side's in horrible condition. I have a lot of stickers on it. They're pretty inexpensive, unpainted. They use 2 different screws on each side, so keep that in mind. These ones are nice and easy to remove. So get a 10mm fastener back here, or a wrench, and it's a 6mm fastener actually. The later ones, you need to dismantle the taillight and the rear fender to get these side skirts off. And you kind of start from the back and move towards the front. They have these 2 tabs and these pegs that hold in there. The reflectors, generally, if you want to replace the reuse the reflectors, they're not really technically reusable. You just want to break these tabs off. So these reflectors, they're pretty expensive. If you do want to reinstall them, we do have them available. But better yet, if you're painting the whole bike, give it that Euro look and get rid of the reflectors altogether. And the easiest way to remove the reflectors is take a flush set of wire cutters, cut those pegs really, really close to the clip. And typically, at that point, give them a little rock and they'll come right out. And the clips There you go. So see that clip just separated like that? And then you can just get these reflectors out of the way. And this thing, you can see it's all corroded and yucky. If I was going to reuse this part, I have my body shop fill those 2 holes right there. One thing you do want to remove, whether you're replacing this or repainting it, is this little tab stud right here. It's a pretty unique item. We do have these available if you do, they're missing or you don't have them, but that little tab bends. And at this point, this piece is ready to go to the body shop. But I think too much is ground down. I mean, if it was just a couple little scratches, I could put a little body filler. Maybe it's possible to save this. You know, sand that flush. You just start changing the shape when it really gets ground, so it may be even worth replacing it. But I know the other side's in really bad shape, so. And while we're at it, remove these little grommets out of the frame. I'm gonna put them in the new frame, but I generally don't like when those are painted. Just kind of bugs me, even though you don't see them. But I've seen crappy paint jobs where those things have been painted. So now that you got that side skirt out of the way, there's 2 fasteners on the side of, you know, they're on both sides. These kind of longer screws. And then you got these little floorboard end caps. It's a little bit long. That screw is probably not the correct screw, so I'll put the correct screw in there when it's gonna be a shorter screw. This piece is totally usable. The other side is pretty ground down, so I'll have to replace that. Put that in my pile of painted parts. There's little frame plugs for the engine mount. You can get those out of the way. At this point, so there's the piece, a little bit too ground down. I'm just gonna throw that away and start with a new one. You got one last fastener, and it's right in the battery tray. It's kind of in the center there. And it's a step screw, and on the later ones it actually retains like a main fuse holder as well. And I would say I can bag all this hardware because I know it's all for the floorboard and these side skirts to kind of recognize all the pieces. And at this point, the glove box should just pull right out. There's a lot of grit in there. Could take the foot pegs off first, but I don't think it's really necessary. So if you lift these out, then it will just kind of go right past them. All right, so go ahead and lift the floorboard out of the way. Kind of got to clear this fan motor. You could take the fan motor off if you wanted to. And I have it out of the way of the foot pegs. And just lift it just like that. And am I going to reuse this floorboard? Probably not. It's pretty busted up in this corner. But before you throw this part away, this side's got a little clip right here. I'll pull that off. That's the other side, actually, it's a different style screw that holds that little floorboard end cap. So keep that in mind. So generally, whenever these scooters go over underside, this trim gets pretty beat up. It just kind of clips onto the edge. With the Primaveras and Sprints, the 946, the 2023, they actually have trim that screws in place. So it's kind of a more robust trim. But this was a pretty unique design that kind of interfaces the metal to the inner plastic floorboard in the glove box. And it works really good. We have these available as a pair in black. I'll probably put the black ones on, or you could buy them individually as the original equipment silver part. So pretty easy to get and replace. Kind of covered replacement of those parts just in the past. So at this point, there's a lot of stuff. We'll probably start by removing the engine because that's the heaviest part. And then we'll pull the fork out. And at that point, it's just take all this wiring out. You got some stuff to bag. I'll bag all the hardware that's for the floorboard here, kind of keep this all together. I know this is all for the floorboard. And so I'll have this all in one spot when it comes time to put it back together. All right, so the next step, we're gonna get the coolant out of here. Obviously everything's nice and cool. This hose clamp's been replaced. Sometimes they have a single use hose clamp that you may need to cut with a large set of diagonal pliers. I'd recommend replacing it with a worm gear clamp like this. And loosen it, you can already see it's starting to drip a little bit. Slide the clamp out of here. And sometimes you can just wiggle the hose off like this one. And just be prepared. I have a tray underneath. Catch the coolant. I don't have the radiator cap on, so it's going to come out pretty quick. Not really the cleanest job usually. And now we'll kind of hose that, some in the reserve there. And then we're gonna move over to the other side. Since we got the floorboard off, there's one more clamp. So there's the supply hose. It's gonna leak a little bit into the frame. You could use compressed air to kind of blow the coolant out. And I just have the tray under there. A little bit's gonna go into the tray here. And we can actually keep this whole hose with the engine. There's these two hose clamps right here. And then it goes through the frame, just like a grommet right back here. So you can push the hose right through. These hoses generally last quite a long time, but you know, they are getting pretty old. Some of the ones that flex with the engine, it may be worth just replacing them. They're not all that expensive. Kind of wiggle that through the frame. Got like a grommet back here that's actually molded onto the hose. And sometimes you just want to use a screwdriver to kind of push it through. So that grommet takes a little bit of effort to get out. It's just pretty dry and old. Then you're able to pull this hose through the frame right here. So I have it loosened from the clamps here and here, and just make sure whatever's drained out of it. And at this point we could just tuck this up with the engine so it could stay with the engine, and I put it back in, or I'll probably just put a new hose just because that thing's pretty dry. And kind of clean up my mess, dispose of the coolant correctly. All right, so now I'm gonna go ahead and prepare the motor to be pulled out. A lot of wiring and hoses. We already disconnected the radiator hoses, obviously, and we have underneath the seat, and we're gonna go ahead and start dismantling some of the parts under here. So you got a fuel line on the top of that throttle body, and it's retained by a little single screw right there. Go ahead and separate that. There's several zip ties, including this one that has a clamp. You may want to put the marks on there. I also have a zip tie kind of holding the injector kind of to the side there, because if that injector connector is in the center, more likely you're going to break the injector connector there. So go ahead and just clip these zip ties. You may want to mark them. That little piece of tube, I'll reuse that. You have some zip ties holding the charging wiring to this air intake hose, and you have wiring going right to this little junction right here. On the much newer ones, this junction is actually underneath the floorboard, so it's a little more difficult. These older ones, they have this separate little plate. Made the job a little easier. This little bracket here holds all this wiring. That's already popped out of the clip, but normally that would be right there. That's for the ignition pickup and your oil pressure sensor. Just go ahead and lift, pop that off. And we have this charging connector right here for the stator, and you could actually pop these little plastic things right through on the back side, just like that. And I'll do the same even with this connector, so it's much easier to reinstall. So that little clip that should be with the connector, go ahead and pop that out just to show you how that goes, and it slides into the connector just like that. And this charging connector, go ahead and pull that and just rock it until that connection disconnects, just like that. There's one last connector that's found on This little block right here, it's for the fuel pump. It's another zip tie there. And the last connector, might as well just go ahead and pop that one through too. So we can separate that plate. We'll set that aside. And what that connector does is it goes to the fuel tank. I'll go ahead and disconnect it. We're gonna take the scooter all the way down. There's one more zip tie here holding that. And a lot of people don't know about this fuse block, but this is where the main fuse is on a GTS 250, kind of hidden right here. And they have a little tab. And usually you can rock it right out. So if you push that tab, and then you could shift the whole thing out. There we go. And it's a little stuck. Whatever, I'll come back to it. So we got the charging connector right here. We have our fuel lines. If the scooter's been run recently, there's gonna be pressure in these. A lot of times you wanna put a rag over top of these connections. So the way you disconnect these, there's these two white buttons. You can sometimes do it with your fingers. I'll do it sometimes. So you push them both in. You push the connector in and then carefully slide it off. And it's like a plastic barb. And I'm kind of intentionally having it pointed down because it is going to leak some fuel. There's the injector connector right here, and it's got a little tab on the front. I push that little metal tab, carefully rock that off. The injector connector is very fragile. And then you have your return line. Pretty much the same steps for the. And if you're doing this on a 300, they only have one fuel line. These older ones had a return and a supply line. So this is your engine temperature sensor. You can get your finger underneath that tab right there and lift that out of the way. So now you can see some of the wiring is kind of pulling away. Underneath this boot, I don't have the battery connected. Pull that boot and you see that tab right there. Go ahead, push it down and rock that big multi-pin connector off the ECU right here. So it's kind of nice to get the ECU out of the way because the hoses for the fuel line kind of route underneath it. And it's also easier to disconnect the throttle cable. So you have two large hose clamps. And kind of note the position of where those hose clamps are. That's where you have the easiest access to them. And at this point, I know that intake manifold is nice and new because I replaced it, I don't know, maybe a year ago. And sometimes this boot, usually these, they get a little hard over time, but this one's still in good condition. It goes to the air box, kind of just get in between it with a flat blade screwdriver. And you have a single cable on these older GTSs. The 300s and the very last of the 250s had two cables. So it's a little more difficult to remove, but these ones were a little simpler. And you could use, I think it's a 12 millimeter. I just happen to have an adjustable wrench and loosen that, and then go ahead and remove. And you just take the barrel right out and set that in a safe place. And we'd probably put a rag or something in the intake. So with that throttle body out of the way, you can see the fuel lines kind of separate. And I also have much easier access to this one hose right here, which is the evaporative emissions system that's in the frame. We'll take that out at a later step. And they work pretty good. A lot of people want to disconnect this stuff, but I don't know, keeps your your garage would smell like fuel. So to me, I'd rather leave it in place, and it was there for a reason. So a hose that's stubborn, you could just push it off the barb, like I'm doing here. If I tried pulling it, it's like what are those things that are like a Chinese finger trap, where it just wants to tighten up onto the barb even further, so it makes it even more difficult. They do have a hose or a zip tie that kind of holds it to that coolant hose right there, and same with the air box. Could get the air box out of the way, that makes it a little easier too. Remove the motor. But I'm gonna go ahead and disconnect this starter lead right here. Zip tie on this side, and that just disconnects just like that off the starter motor. There's several clamps that hold all this wiring to the engine. Go ahead and start disconnecting it. And you can see there's the starter lead can just stay with the motor now. It's easy to disconnect from the relay, but there is 1 or 2 ground straps. So there's one ground at your engine. You're gonna need an 8mm socket. Take that off. So that's a ground for your starter. We'll go ahead and put the screw just back in place for now. And some models, they also have a ground strap that goes from the frame down to the belt cover. This one doesn't have that. Pretty important is this ground is tight. You end up with sometimes the scooter starts stalling and acting odd if you have a loose ground, because the ECU depends on a good ground from this one. That's why they went to a redundant 2 separate grounds on the later ones. Also, you start hearing the cooling fan come on and off. That's also sometimes indication that you have a bad ground on the engine. And down here, I'm just disconnecting one last connector. There's a connector for the oxygen sensor. And lift up on the tab. It's just like that. It's the same as that connectors that we disconnected on the early steps. So there's a tab, and you could just go ahead and pull that up and separate the connector. There we go, I'll kind of show it there. And there's a boot that stays on it like that. So at this point, the wiring from the frame of the scooter is now separated from the motors. No more wiring that's attaching the motor. This wiring right here stays with the motor. That's your charging. We could leave the air box in place, but I am going to loosen it. If you do want to remove the air box, a lot of times you just need to take one of the hoses off. Maybe I will, just to make it a little easier. I have a hose clamp, a regular worm gear hose clamp on this one here. Oftentimes they have the one-time use clamps, like there is on this valve cover right here. That you just need to cut off with a diagonal set of pliers. I'm going to leave this hose. This is going to stay with the motor. And kind of just get it all nestled in here so it comes out. It's not entangling with everything. So the next step, we're gonna go ahead and remove the muffler and clamp the front, put a scissor jack in the middle and pull the motor out. All right, so we're gonna get the muffler out of the way. I tend to like to leave the header with the muffler if I'm removing the engine. The O2 sensor is already disconnected, and there's a little rubber clamp that kind of keeps it in place. So that's a 10mm wobble. Kind of a little bit longer one. In the past, I've actually shared the snap-on number. It's pretty hard to find like a long wobble. It's possible to use a regular one too. So. And they're a little difficult to get up in there. All right, and then the original fasteners were T40 for Torx drive. Let's see, probably better to use one in a socket. There we go. try to see if there's enough room to even, oh yeah, there we go. There. And again, you could probably bag this little set of hardware. It's all specific for the muffler, holds the muffler. It's pretty difficult to get the engine out with the muffler in place because the muffler kind of, the header pipe goes through the subframe of, you know, pretty much the hanger that goes between the frame of the scooter and the engine. And also, if you want to remove the shocks, the fastener is kind of right behind the muffler there. The last one's kind of, I want to drop. Obviously, power tools make this go a little quicker. There we go. And make sure that O2 sensor wire doesn't get caught up on anything like it is right there. Pull the muffler out. Perfect time to restore this muffler. Put a nice fresh coat of like high temp barbecue paint, wire brush it. Probably do that, make it look nice and fresh. All right, so we're gonna get the air box out on this right side here. There's a nut on this frontmost location for the air box. This long screw comes out. I was using my finger to kind of hold it in place. And then these two thread into the rear inner fender for the tire. So, and oftentimes they're still trapped in there, so you want to use a needle nose. Pull those screws out. And just gonna make the job a little easier. You could just loosen the air box and lift it up enough to loosen the shock, but I went ahead and disconnected that hose up at the top. And without the throttle body in place, we'll be able to lift this out of the frame here. Get it out of here. Make sure it's not entangled with anything. Pull the air box out, perfect time to place the filter or whatever. Place a gasket in there, but you see the inner fender is kind of loose at this point. And I'll go ahead and set those aside here. I'm not gonna bother draining the engine oil out because the motor just kind of comes out as a whole assembly. There is one thing I am gonna jump on before. Typically, I'd remove the brake caliper. Like whenever I remove the motor, just to rebuild the motor, I'd remove the brake caliper so I don't need to upset the hydraulic system. But in this case, I think your best bet is actually to disconnect the rear brake hose up from the master cylinder. So it's kind of still attached to the thing. I'm gonna leave the wheel in place and all that. So I'm gonna jump up to the handlebars and disconnect the hydraulic brake right here. So, all right, so here we have the rear master cylinder on the left side here. I kind of wipe around the lid, make sure there's no debris or dirt, and pull the two screws out. And a couple tricks to kind of dismantle the system without getting too much air into that pipe. So go ahead and lift that off. I did bleed the brakes or flush the brake fluid pretty recently on one of the videos, I think, even. So it's got pretty fresh brake fluid in there. So at this point, you gotta be careful pulling this. Sometimes it will squirt out just like that, you know, out of the top. So we're gonna go ahead and use a syringe and remove the majority of the fluid out of the reservoir. You don't necessarily need to have one this big, but. And one of my techs started doing this. He usually likes to just absorb the last little bit with a clean rag like this. And oftentimes he would just shove it in there and put the cap back on there. And it kind of just absorbs any of the brake fluid that's in there. But right now the brake is still working because there's still fluid in the piston. I have another rag handy. I'm gonna take a 14 millimeter. There's a banjo bolt right back here. So I have the rag under here. Obviously, you probably should be wearing eye protection. Go ahead and just crack it. And at this point, a lot of times I like putting a zip tie on the lever, or electrical tape or anything, you know, something just to hold the lever. I should use this O-ring right here. This will work just as well. It's actually the O-ring they use for doing a brake lever test. So that's holding it in place, kind of all the way closed. So once you have it in this position, it's not going to leak any more fluid out. And we'll go ahead and pull the banjo screw off. And typically you want to throw those crush washers. It's going to be a pair of these copper crush washers, aluminum crush washers. Just throw them away because they're technically only supposed to be used one time. And it's not likely going to leak too much fluid. It only leaked a tiny bit with that method, you know. And go and put the banjo bolt back in place, maybe wrap it with some electrical tape. You just don't really want debris going into your brake system. So with this banjo bolt, you don't want debris going in that. And a lot of times I'll take like a vinyl cap, I'll kind of thread it in there, and it just kind of blocks the hole. You could use like a rubber plug, maybe you can find wire, something that's just like rubbery, just to kind of block the hole off. I mean, you could probably jam it with tape it up really well. That would work just as well. So I'm gonna just jam that thing in there. There's a little hole right here, and that's all I wanna do is block that little hole. Up at the top, there's this single zip tie, kind of holds a lot of the cables. It also has a little sheath on it that you wanna save that sheath when we put it all back together. And at this point, we can go ahead and get some of the cables out of this clamp right here, specifically the rear brake hose. So I got the throttle cable out of there, and just kind of just snake it out. And now at this point I could feed it through, and they're still completely full of fluid. We're not going to touch the brakes, so it's going to be really easy to bleed when it comes time to put it all back together. So, and at this point we're going to loosen the shocks, put a scissor lift in there, loosen the center mount, and yank the motor out. And if you're just going to do body work on this, you don't necessarily need to remove the motor, but I'm essentially doing like a frame off restoration of a Vespa GTS, pretty much stripping it down to the bare frame. And if you want the look factory original paint job, that's just what you got to do, because painting around all this wiring and the engine, you just doesn't yield for the best paint job. All right, so the scooter's on a center stand. I can see nothing's except for the two shocks and the engine mount. Everything else is separated. So you could get a 17mm combination wrench on this inner lower shock eyelet right there, and go ahead and remove. It's got a nylock lock-in nut, so it's got a lot of friction to it. You don't want that fastener coming out. All right, it's almost out. And you could just pull that right out. One thing to keep in mind, there's these two spacers, they're pretty easy to lose. I'll go ahead and pull those out, and maybe I'll just leave them with this whole setup so you remember that you need those. On the right shock, go ahead and remove the nut and the washer, a lot easier. And at this point, we're gonna go ahead and put a combination wrench on this side, which is the bolt for the engine mount right there. And I'll go on the other side and loosen the nylon lock-in nut for the main engine pivot here. I've seen scooters that have been crashed pretty hard. Sometimes this bolt's actually bent. I'm kind of curious. I don't think so. This thing, it tracks perfectly even though the body was in horrendous shape. So at this point, still up on the center stand, got the nut out of the way. I'm gonna put a scissor jack right in the middle. And we'll go ahead and pull the shock bolt out. So that's out. And we'll take enough pressure off the frame where the main engine pivot bolt just wants to go right through. So going through pretty easy right now. You don't need to go too crazy on the jack. And we got the bolt right here. I don't know if I'll be able to pull it out. I'll be able to pull it out with the pliers. Perfect time if those engine pivot bushings that are in the engine are worn. Change those out. These look great actually still, so. There we go. And then you got a spacer that drops out too, so keep that with the bolt. And at this point, I'll show you the motor's gonna wanna come backwards, but we'll get this mud flap out of the way. Take my license plate off here. Just gonna make it a little easier. Probably something I should have did before I started the motor, but I'm gonna repaint that fender. The old ones are cool. They still had a painted rear fender. Actually, I had a customer recently request on a newer one to have that painted, so thought that was interesting because on the newer ones it's just a black piece of plastic. They got these little screws right here. There's one fastener underneath there as well. You want to get, usually it's going to be a 7mm socket. Sometimes the fastener is a little corroded too. Yeah, I've seen situations where I have to cut them off. Sometimes you can go back and forth or spray it with a little bit of like Pen Trent, WD-40 or something. There we go. We got it. Definitely be replacing those screws. And there's gonna be a couple two little washers that drop out as well. That just separates like this. It's got this little tail here. You also have that little clip that goes with the lower fastener. So yeah, start removing them. I'll go ahead and bag all the hardware that's for the license frame. All right, so I'm lifting my scissor jack. And at this point, just kind of look, make sure nothing's entangled. And the motor should just pull right out. Sometimes you got the shocks in the way. And the nice thing is the motor's a nice little compact unit that you can just roll around because it's got the wheel still on, the center stand. It's just much easier to deal with, especially if you're, trying to stay organized and you don't need some heavy part. So we'll go ahead and pull that out. The last thing I did forget was there's the spark plug cap. I didn't pull that off. So that is on the wire right here. All right, so we got the motor right here, the hose clamp for the, and the nice thing is it just wheels right out. So I put a little cap on the coolant so it's not dripping coolant everywhere. And you got the brake line, all that. Go ahead and set that aside. All right, so at this point, I'm gonna work from the back and move towards the front, removing the last accessories, all the wiring, the lenses, the actuators for the seat pop, some of the last plumbing, and we'll move our way all the way up to the radiators and the handlebars and then drop the forks. So that's kind of my order of operations if I'm gonna completely dismantle a Vespa for a paint job. And the rack, there's like these two fasteners, sometimes they're Torx. The old ones, they're actually two 4mm Allens, which are sometimes a little fragile. And again, just kind of keeping little piles of the hardware. So I stay organized, I'll bag them up as I go. So this is the, I like to call this the gas tank surround. So there's two fasteners on the back. And they got some washers. That one washer I'll grab. star washer and a flat washer, and then kind of hold the rack because the last one is gonna. So at this point, kind of, you can rock the rack right out of the way. Set the rack aside, remove your fuel cap. The fuel tank's really full. It's probably a good idea to siphon out because sometimes, even though the fuel pump doesn't really, it kind of holds the pressure back, is what I've found is if you have the cap on there, sometimes it will build pressure and still push it through the fuel lines. That little rubber comes off and this lifts out of the way. And while we're on the back, remove these lenses here. So, single Phillips screw in the center there, just kind of slide it down. There's a connector. Also, just to show you something, if you want a steel robot scooter, I do have an extra key back there. That's just where I keep those. I learned that from Karen when she was doing the scooter cannonball. She never wanted to lose a key on the road. And so that was something, I don't know how many people are gonna know the look there. So, especially when you need a screwdriver. So that little connector actually goes right there. We'll wrap that up just like I did in the earlier steps. This little grommet right here, you actually push it from the inside out, and then you could slide the connector and all that in just like that. Turnstiles, got some little fasteners here. Perfect opportunity to upgrade them with some nice LED switchback ones. So the little rubber boot pulls back. There's a tab. Go pull that. Again, I'll keep that with it. And then in each corner, there's going to be a Tinderman clip that's specific for the turn signal. Pretty much same steps on this side. Another thing that I failed to do is a lot of times I like to pressure wash a scooter real thoroughly. You could pressure wash in the engine. Obviously you don't want to get too crazy directing the stream right into like electrical parts, you know, the connectors, because you could get corrosion, but at least wash away the dust and all that. Gonna just make for a cleaner job. This one seems a little sloppy since it's dirty right now. So all this stuff I'll set aside. The wiring just kind of goes like in there. Set that aside. I'll bag up all this hardware. And our next step, we're gonna go ahead and get the shocks out of the way. All right, so put the cap on, just, you know, there's some, I can kind of smell the vapors of gas, and I got electric impact. So 13 millimeter, this is the quickest way to get them out, is have an impact. And almost have the nut all the way off. It's a fine thread. It's not like normal threads. Go and pull it down. And you have this rubber bushing. You have a smaller rubber bushing, a flat washer, and a split washer. Again, if you're doing a full restoration, maybe a perfect opportunity to upgrade the shocks. Those adjusters look so like seized up, I probably couldn't even adjust them. One thing to keep in mind, they are identical left to right, even though they mount differently on the lower point. Set those aside. We're gonna go ahead and pull the fuel tank out. And there's this one hose right here, the evaporative emissions hose. And it's got the one-time use clamp. And two ways you can go about it. Sometimes you could open them up, like kind of get under the seam and just pry it out. And you don't necessarily need to use those exact same clamps. You could just use the regular worm gear clamp. It would be like a number 4 style worm gear clamp. So that's, at this point, is trash. Sometimes you can even inch the hose off with the clamp on. Seen that occur in the past. And now we're gonna go ahead and remove the fuel tank. Really easy when the motor's not in the way. So there's a single screw back here. And we're gonna need to remove that fuel cap again. So you got this screw. And again, keep those in their own little pile here. So you have a fastener up here in the front, right where the wiring harness is. And I already pushed this connector back there. That's for both the fuel pump and the fuel level gauge. So at this point, there's only one more fastener holding the tank. So I'm gonna put my hand underneath here, and this is pretty much what you gotta do if you gotta change the fuel level sensor. I've covered how to remove the tank. When a scooter's crashed, I found sometimes the tanks get stuck in here pretty well. See, it's not even wanting to drop out because the actual body is pushed into the tank. So just being extra careful, kind of pushing it down. I've seen even tanks even ruined from really bad crashes where the frame's damaged. And sometimes on the back, you might have some of the wiring for the taillight might be hanging up. Just kind of hanging up a little bit. And normally with a frame that has no damage, it's much easier. FY, you'd be pulling the tank if you are doing the body work to the frame. You know, a body man's not going to want to do welding and spot welding on a frame to do the body work when you have a fuel tank still in place. So this is definitely something you got to do. Typically we always remove them when we do the body work on a scooter or send it out for paint and body work. And you have a single connector right here. The later ones, they don't have this separate little wiring harness. You'd have to actually reach in there and disconnect both the fuel pump, which is close to my right hand, and this uppermost one, which is your fuel level sender. There's still fuel in here, so go ahead and put the cap on there. Probably a perfect time to clean the tank. And just to show you some of the damage on the tank, this is still in good shape, but some of that damage is from the bodywork that's been pushed into the plastic fuel tank. These fuel tanks are super rugged. They don't rust. There's a lot of good things that they're plastic actually. So at this point, we'll just go ahead and set that aside, and we can now work on getting the wiring out of the way. So this is the evaporative emissions or vent hose. Go ahead and just route that out of this seat actuator bracket right here. They have a single zip tie that's pretty important that holds the seat cable on there, because the problem is if that seat cable pops out, like I'll show you how I'm going to pop it out, pops out the back, then you're never going to be able to open the seat with either the manual or the automatic release. So went ahead and popped that off. There's this little retainer that holds it like that. The seat thing just works like that. A lot of times this is loose. So you always want to check these screws. But at this point, we just want to get this out of the way. I'll get a couple of Phillips here. That one's a little loose. And that could be just set aside with the hardware. There's a relay on this side and the diagnostic connector. We'll go ahead and just leave all the connections on the relay. It's not going to hurt anything. And then there's a single connection for the diagnostic connector. And you may want to mark these or take photos of where all these little clips are. I'll start making little bags, and same with these little plastic retaining clips. You want to start popping them out, bagging them up, and they're used in several different spots of the scooter. We're going to save all these little clips because we got to put those in the new frame. You could technically paint over them, but if you are doing a complete paint job, it's nice to remove them as well, you know, if you're using an existing frame. So it's just that much more of a professional paint job where it looks like scooter's never been repainted, because I see those telltales all the time where you see overspray on wiring and, clips and all that, and it just doesn't look good. So sometimes after a wreck on the right side, the tail light or turnstiles won't work, and it's because of this pretty thin wiring harness right here. There's little clips that hold it to the inner part of the frame, and it may be severed and need repairs. If you're wondering what the little red marks are, that's where they typically have tabs. See, it almost lines up with that little metal tab right there, and it's just an indication. And then you could pull the wiring through the frame, with one exception. There's this little boot for your left turn signal that tends to be in the way. So you could spray some silicone in there, and then you'll be able to pull the connector through this little small opening here, because it's pretty hard to. Another option is actually take the connector off the connector housing off the pins of the connector, but it eventually, with some persuasion, it comes right out, and then we'll be able to snake that connector through, because it goes, this wiring goes right behind there's a frame member back there that kind of keeps it in place. And I'll just kind of want to, just so I remember that's there, I'll just kind of put it in place. Undo the connection from some of the last tabs here, and you could start seeing that it's starting to separate from the frame here. So go ahead and pull this wiring through. There's a hole in the frame down here. That's your taillight wiring. Pretty much, if you had to replace the wiring harness on one of these scooters, it's almost all the steps I'm doing right now. You know, completely dismantling the scooter. The wiring's so integral with the body of the scooter. And it's a perfect time to do any little repairs. See how the heat, they don't even have heat shrink, but it's like electrical tape. It's kind of pulling away. Kind of protect the wiring a little bit better. And we'll make sure that cap stays with this wiring here. And as you can see, this main wiring harness goes through this clip right here on the frame. Some of these clips are really hard to salvage, and you know, they're kind of only designed to be easy to assemble and not to disassemble, so removing them from the frame could be pretty difficult. I do have several of those available on the Scooter West web store, these clamps. There's also a little clamp right there. And you can see the wiring is getting pretty close to loose, but there's a clamp right here that holds it to the frame. And oftentimes you don't need to necessarily cut it off, but you could use a diagonal plier to kind of persuade the clip, or even a needle nose, to kind of get it through. So oftentimes it's pretty difficult to get these out, as I demonstrated, just to show you what is kind of remaining. So this bullet was only designed to go one direction. Not the end of the world. You can't really buy that as a separate part. There is a zip tie they call a fir tree zip tie. Do that. But just as well, you could snake in a zip tie. You could drill another hole and put a zip tie around the wiring harness right here and hold it just in place so it would look just like the original. Got a couple wires right here. So you got the fuse block that I was struggling with earlier, so I have to get that out of the way. So this is the wiring harness that goes right here. Also connects to this fuse holder that has, I think, a pair of fuses. One is the main fuse if you accidentally reverse your battery connection. And this thing is on there tight. There we go. So I kind of walked it off that little tab right there. And you see it has that little locking tab, and there's 30 amp and a 7.5 amp fuse. I think the other one's for the fuel pump, if I recall, or actually the fuel pump one's on this side. Moving on to this side, there's another clip. I have another one of those tabs holding the connection. Let's see if I can successfully salvage this one. I can. And it's kind of intact a little bit. So you got a ground right here on the frame. And this little bracket that holds the fuel pump relay and also a pair of fuses. I think one is for the ignition and one's for the standby power to the ECU. So again, you could just leave that all in place. Probably do want to ID those screws because they are kind of unique. So there's like that one right there. And you could, one way to keep them in place is you just put masking tape on top of them. So I'll know exactly where they go because they are pretty unique, those screws there. So, and we have one last wire kind of snaking back with this hose right here. This is that hose that we pulled through. And this little wire, it's gonna lead back and you're gonna reach underneath and there's a pair of tabs. This is for the seat pop. And what I did, I just squeezed both those and it disconnects it. And you know what's funny? It says VW Germany on the connector. There's a Volkswagen symbol on there. So kind of gives you a telltale. The actuator for the seat pop, I think is probably a Volkswagen part. And at this point, the wiring, with the exception of the wiring that goes to the ignition coil, can be pulled through. So what else do we have back here? We still have some more clips. We have the evaporative emission system. I'll go ahead and pull that out. And all you need is a couple 10s and also actually the backmost item is going to be an actuator assembly. So I'll pull that out. So if you ever have issues while the seat's not popping, you would actually pull this actuator out and it's attached to this bracket in here. So I'll get all these are the same flange nuts, and there's one more. And this is another item that's really hard to get out when a scooter's been crashed, is what I find. So the problem is the frame is pushed up against the canister in there. So it's pretty difficult to get it to come out. So we may need to pry at the frame to pull out. And let's see if I can get this actuator out of here. Get one thing out of the way. And see that little cable? It's gonna pull right through that little hole there. Actuator's almost all the way out here. And again, it's a little more difficult since the frame is a little bit pushed in here. Pretty close. And sometimes if you can't get this out, like I said, you may need to pull the frame out, pull some of the dents out of the frame. Another option is they do have a big strap on the canister right here. And sometimes if you separate the canister out, it's gonna make the job just a little bit easier. So you start getting these items pulled out. Now I'm kind of working from the bottom. This get the roller valve out of here. So almost got it at this point. And I'll show you. With a frame that doesn't have damage on it, this isn't nearly as difficult to get out. So pull this all out, kind of show how it's all set up. So this thing, pretty dirty. I just pulled the clamp out. Normally it could come out as a whole assembly. And this is the device that captures the fumes from the gas tank, and that's called a rollover valve. So that whole assembly comes out. This goes to your fuel tank, that goes to the intake manifold of the carburetor or the fuel injection. And we'll go ahead and just set that aside. And we also have this actuator to show you what this setup is. It could be cleaned up. So this is electro actuator. If it doesn't open up after you place the button, then this actuator may be burned up. There's a combination of the short cable that goes to the latch, and then the long cable is the one that goes all the way up to the manual release. And we're gonna go ahead and pull this cable through. So there's that control cable. Sometimes these cables get seized up from moisture getting in them. It's always pretty nice to have the manual release work as well. And there's a couple clamps, a couple different spots. And at this point, it goes to that hole. You pull the whole actuator with the manual seat release out, and you can just put that all aside. You can wind up the cable here, just like that. And we'll clean all these parts, make them nice and clean. Maybe even put a little bit of lubrication on some of the parts in here. But most people never see these things because they're just kind of buried in the frame. And the last thing is this throttle cable. So it pops out there. If you have a later model, it's gonna have a pair of throttle cables. And you could fish this right through the frame here. And again, to keep these from getting too wild, you could roll them up and kind of like turn them inside on themselves just to organize everything. Some of the last things you wanna keep in mind, there's still clips here. There's a clip here that holds that. Little protection pieces. You want to move those back in place after you're done painting, even one that's buried right here. Take photos, maybe use my video as an ID, kind of see it, but you can feel all the wrinkles in the frame on both sides. When you have all those items out, body shop can easily work in here and pop those dents out successfully without like filling the whole dent in with body filler or Bondo, which is not best practice. All right, so we'll continue getting the wiring out of here. So there's a clamp right here. You can see there's a wire that goes in this little crevice right here. This is where your ignition coil is. Fortunately, these ignition coils are really reliable. I rarely see them fail. But go ahead and zip the pair of fasteners off with a 10mm socket. And the ignition coil is attached to a bracket. And the wire, the spark wire actually goes through a little plastic clamp that's on the frame. Go ahead and release that. And you can see now I can access the whole ignition coil. And just like pretty difficult to find this little tab right here, especially when the ignition coil is in place. But at this point, you can go ahead and separate that. Perfect time to replace the spark wire and the cap. Fortunately, I already did that on this, so go ahead and set this part aside. And the wiring now will pull right through this little center tunnel. And you can see there's little protection sheaths that will move over to the new frame. And I even left the relays in place, so they'll just slide right through, no problem. And so there's the wiring harness. 2 more wires connecting right here, or 1 more wire. This is going to be your voltage regulator connection. So if you got to change the voltage regulator, you can see you got to pull the floorboard. Get access to this connector right here. Sometimes that tab needs a little persuasion. Persuade the connector with a flat blade screwdriver as well. And again, this connector is on one of those little tabs right there. That's going to be pretty hard to get out, but it is possible to get that out. All right, so while we're on the right side here, you have this little junction for the coolant lines, again with a clip right there. There's one little tiny wire that's on a 250. Not going to find this on the 300s. And that's going to be for a temperature sensor for the ambient temperature. And it actually mounts to where the side stand is. So the little sensor connector goes right there. It pulls right through the body like that. And yeah, some of the next steps, we'll start getting the cooling system out of the way as well. So just keep in mind, although that's all your wiring to the center of the scooter. And in the middle right here, we're to one of those pesky clamps. I don't think there's much chance of me getting it out. See if I can get in there with the nail nose and squeeze and have any attempt at saving it. Very, very carefully pulling it out of the hole here. Yeah, I don't think I'm gonna. Well, there we go. So that actually was the tip. If you squeeze it up high, you could actually squeeze those tabs. It's been a while since I messed with those. So that one actually did the best job on salvaging it. More clamps. You see sometimes they have the red, kind of indicates where they go. And then you got more zip ties. Take note of where those zip ties are. I have the trash can handy right here. Got your voltage regulator right there, but there's looks like a snail on top. Go ahead and disconnect our turn signals. Pop the boot off, push the little tab. You can see they also have some wiring for the voltage regulator. Also zip tied to the small radiator hose with a little sheathing on it. And underneath this little boot right here is your DC connection for the voltage regulator. So it just pulls right out. Normally you gotta push that little tab. It's actually protected by this little boot right here. At this point, the regulator is kind of sitting on top of the radiator, and now we could go ahead and start separating the radiators out. So the radiator's out of the way. I got a 10 millimeter. There's gonna be 3 locations. Start with the easier one that has the no fan on it. It does have the voltage regulator on top, and that's only on the early 300s and 250s. They have the voltage regulator sitting on top. And again, this might be really difficult to get out because the frame's a little bit bent. Fortunately, the radiator's not damaged. You know, like I said, it'd take quite a bit of body work to get all this all straight here. Just, all right. And even the plastic shrouding for the radiator is kind of hanging up. Normally that's not the case if everything's all straight. we'll get it out one way or another. One way to do this, there's also a single screw up here in this other position where you'd think there would be a bolt. Go ahead and get that out of the way. It just threads into the plastic shroud. And we'll go ahead and sever these zip ties as well. Just kind of keep the hose. And you can see there's a bypass hose right here. You can leave many of these junctions all together, but some of them where they go through the frame, you're gonna have to go ahead and cut them. And again, you can replace them either with one-time use clamps or probably better yet, just a regular hose clamp. And my recommendation is get everything hooked up. You want to inspect all these once you get the scooter all assembled. The last thing you want to do is have one of these leak and you have the bodywork like the floorboard and the glove box all back on. So a lot of times it's a good idea just to check all this. And you see they're on plastic fittings, so they push right off. Still a little bit of coolant in there. And at this point I could pull this out much easier. It's still stuck on there. And that's kind of pretty typical when they've been craft. And you can see the voltage regulator sitting on top of this. This is a Ducati voltage regulator. It's got this square look to it. I would definitely recommend replacing this because it is prone to failure. Hasn't failed on my scooter yet, but I'll probably replace it. And that's something that's an issue on almost all 250s. And even the early 300s, they use this more squared off regulator. If it has the little angles to it, and I think it's the company says Schneider or something, it's a different brand, those are pretty reliable and they were used on later, and the replacement ones are the more reliable ones. So I'll probably replace that part since you can see how much work it is just to get that out. So we're gonna get a couple more hoses out. I already cut the clamp on this lower radiator hose. This is a common failure hose right here. It's probably not a bad idea just to replace it. The problem is you gotta push it out just like that other pesky hose. You gotta push them out from the inside out here. So still got a little bit of water in it. And it's got that built-in grommet right there. So you can see the radiator is kind of flopping in the breeze right here. You have the coolant reservoir tank. We'll go ahead and get that out of the way. Sometimes they're Phillips screws. Also, you could use a 10. I find they're always loose for some reason. They just work their way loose all the time. And there's a single screw up here. That one was very loose as well. And the tank, you can see it's got a couple things connected to it. You have this upper hose right here. So keep those two fasteners. They're pretty specific to this coolant tank. And on really high mileage GTS, I do see these tanks sometimes rupture. They're a pressurized coolant tank. So we'll go ahead and cut that hose clamp here. Go ahead and pull that off. And we're getting a little closer. So that's one way to get these clamps out of here. Sometimes just kind of squeeze them from the top. And I'm gonna leave that junction with the lower junction with this right radiator, and then I'll leave the other side with the left radiator. There's another junction that we're gonna disconnect from the front. So another hose clamp right there. Pretty difficult to cut those sometimes. And again, the best way to get these off, just lever that hose. There we go. So radiator, yeah, it's just got a little bit of a bend. Perfect time to clean that radiator. They're pretty reliable for the most part. Still had a little coolant in there. set that aside. But if the radiator is like parallelogram from a really heavy crash, probably a good time to replace it. I think they're pretty inexpensive. All right, so there's a single fastener that holds this upper junction, kind of pushes out of the way. Again, we'll keep that all together. We'll bag that hardware. For right now, I'll just put it back in. And then moving on to the back. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and get our left radiator out. There's a single zip tie down here that holds that wire for the temperature sensor. Unfortunately, this side isn't so dented in, so the radiator should come out much easier. Typically, you could just take the 3 flange nuts out, and if everything's all straight and not beat in, it will just pull right off, just like that. So I can leave it with the plastic shroud, air intake shroud. So you do have a connector for your cooling fan. It looks the same as the turnstile connectors, and we should be able to just get all these hoses, and that's about all the hoses we got to disconnect. And there's our whole entire left radiator assembly. All right, this has been a long video, but we're getting close now. So got the throttle cable. Leave that with the handlebars. You don't necessarily need to remove the throttle assembly. Again, you could kind of stay organized and loop all this here. You have the speedometer cable. It goes in this little clamp right here. These clamps, it is possible to remove them. They do have a center little pin, and those clamps are also found where the wiring goes through in the back. This is our front brake hose, and we'll go ahead and just kind of unwind this from these little clips that kind of hold them onto the frame. They're like wire thing. It's probably easier if I could turn the steering, but we'll get it. There we go. So you could see the brake hose for the front brake goes kind of behind the steering right there. There's gonna be one trick I'm gonna do for the front hydraulic system. So a lot of times you could just remove the master cylinder, remove the lever, and you can leave it all hooked up so it doesn't leak. That's one possibility. You could disconnect the banjo bolt just like I did for the rear as well. But that, of course, introduces air into the system. Moving on to the ignition system, you have the single clip kind of behind here. It looks like a D-shaped clip. And it pulls right out like that. And then the ignition switch can pull right out. And you could actually leave the D-clip with the switch too. I think it will kind of stay in place. When it comes time to reinstall it, put the clip back into the frame. These scooters have an immobilizer system. So you can carefully pop this antenna. This is the antenna that receives the code out of the chip. And you just carefully pry that off. There's 3 little plastic little tabs that hold that in place. This thing's a little fragile, so it might be just worth disconnecting it. So it's like a 3-pin connector, just slides right out. Set that aside. It's a pretty expensive part. They do fail sometimes. So you have a pair of zip ties that hold the wiring to the handlebars. We have most of the wiring disconnected with the exception of the brake switches. And just like the turnstiles and that cooling fan, you just push a little tab and they slide out. Some of them have a different setup where it's 2 individual connectors. So just depending on the year, they've changed the brake switches. Cut the zip ties. And at this point, you can see the handlebar wiring is separating and it kind of goes in front of all the other wiring. At this point, we've probably cut like 25 zip ties. And the wiring kind of goes right through here. Got the fuse block. There's the last couple things up front. There's these pair of relays, and they're actually easier to get off from the back. So in here is a little tab that you could push up on the very lower part, and they shift up. And it'll do that with both those relays. Some models have more relays than others. GTV has more relays because they got a separate relay for the high beam and the low beam. So we could push those through. This does have the little extra thing for the front rack here. And the last two terminals that we need to disconnect are the horn, and then we'll be able to just pull this straight off the horn. All right, so get those relays out of here. And at this point, we'll get the whole wiring harness out of the scooter. You can see it's all routed very specifically. Lots of photos could be helpful in disassembly. The owners, or not the owners, the service manual does have some rudimentary routing diagram of this wiring, but pretty much the whole entire wiring of the scooter is all this with the relays and everything. So I have that all separated out. You can see now the scooter looks much simpler and easier to work on. Some of the remaining items to get out of the way, pretty self-explanatory. The turnstiles, just like the rear, there's a lot of clips still left behind. Little plastic clips hold here. We got the side stand out on bolt, the temperature sensor. I'm not going to unbolt it right now, but there's several bolts that hold this engine subframe in here. There's a large bolt that goes all the way through. There's a pair of bolts on this upper part, and that all pulls out and will get swapped over. And of course the foot pegs. But let's get on to removing the steering. So we're gonna go ahead and leave the front brake system sealed for right now. And go ahead and get the lever out of the way because that makes it a little more compact. There's a nut on the bottom and a big flat screw on the top. So. And the rear, I'll just leave it all alone because that's all fine, doesn't need to really move. All right. And don't forget there's a pair of washers, some grease in there, so I'll keep those all with the master cylinder. I'll put the lever aside. And the good thing is you won't be pushing on the brake. And one last thing, sometimes it's a good idea even to take the brake switch off. Those just unthread from the master cylinder. To remove the master cylinder, it's just the pair of fasteners that clamp it to the handlebars here. It does say up, that clamp does have a specific direction. And the idea being is that's disconnected, you could put that through with the fork when we pull the fork through. And there's a peg on this that locates it to the handlebars. So we'll get that all situated. So to pull the handlebars, you'll need an 8mm Allen key here and a 17mm socket, or I'm just going to use a combination wrench. It actually has a socket on the end, and usually it's pretty tight. There we go. And oftentimes if you're changing the fender, I did a whole separate video just removing the fork if you need to replace the fender, because you do remove this fork just to do the fender. So there's that bolt right there. Go ahead and pull straight up on the handlebars and we'll be able to pull the handlebars out. Kind of a lot of rust on the top of this, so it may need a couple knocks with a hammer. There we go. little gentle persuasion here. Second round of gentle persuasion. There we go. So it got some weight to it because they got the bar and weights. Set that aside. They have this little grease shield. Some of the early models didn't have this, so that pulls right up. Tell those bearings are pretty dry in there. So go ahead and set that aside. So I got tool SN, which has the 4 prongs. This is the Scooter West part number for this. And that's the lock nut. And then this lock washer that also has a tang on the front. That's what engages with that plastic. And then we have what retains the front fork. And the way it's kind of mounted right now, you may want to have 2 people help you. Is kind of wanting the pull out right now. So it's kind of nice to have the fork clamp and just lift the whole frame off. I'll see if I can just do it all by myself. So you can see, let the pressure off there. These bearings are pretty dry. I'm surprised this thing steered as nice as it does, but it's gonna ride even nicer once you have fresh grease on these bearings. You know, these bearings, eventually they do need grease. That grease is really, really dry on there. And there's, all this stuff is gonna wanna go through this hole right here. And this is where it helps if you have 2 people, kind of lift the frame off. As things, the cables kind of want to go through no problem. And you should be able to, I have to take the clamp off if I recall. All right, so you kind of start levering the frame off, and you pull the throttle cable through, or the speedometer cable that is, and kind of get the master cylinder through. One thing to keep in mind, you might as well just disconnect the banjo if you are going to change a fender. But if you aren't going to change a fender, that's one way to not have to deal with the hydraulic system. Just doing it a little different than what I've even set up in the past. And at this point, probably want to have somebody help you out. And you just lift the frame right off the fork. So definitely better if you have somebody to help you do that. And you got to watch out for the fork. It's going to want to fall over as well. So go ahead and take this out of this tire clamp. It's got some weight to it. And it's kind of awkward just because you got a wheel on it. Once it rotates around, a lot of times it's nice to not have a wheel on the front fork, but it does come out with the wheel. So at this point, I'm going to show you how to remove this ignition right here. All right, so there's a couple parts of your ignition system. So the actual electrical key switch, which has a detent, has already been removed in that earlier step. And I left it with the wiring. This is your lever, so whenever you push the lock in, it opens your glove box. Has a nut on one side and the bolt on the other side, so we'll remove that in another step. And the only way you're going to remove this lock tumbler is if you have the key in the off position and you line up this little window right here. I have a lot of people ask, how do you take the locks out on these things? Well, I don't do too many videos on this because if you have it the ignition unlocked, this is essentially how you take the lock tumbler out, essentially stealing the scooter. So you gotta lever this little clip out. Almost got it there. I can tell it had a little bit of crust in there and rust, just from age. So go ahead and pull the clip out. And eventually will release the whole entire tumbler, so just like that. And this grease is pretty old. Perfect opportunity to replace this trim ring on the outside. It's pretty inexpensive. The way the tumbler comes out is you could just carefully press, and it will pop out just like that. So a lot of times that little clip stays behind, or the little nylon gasket. So you could pry that out. It's completely dry in there. Normally this should have some grease, and we could put that little gasket back on there. I'll put some lightweight like lithium grease on all this, and when I reassemble it, but that's pretty much your Loctite cylinder, and it would just reinstall like that. I'll show those steps. Don't lose that little clip. We do have it available as a replacement part. There's one more thing that comes out. So say your steering lock is damaged, or maybe you drilled the ignition out because you had to replace this. This part oftentimes gets damaged. So it pushes out from the backside, and you have to have the fork out. And you can see it engages. Show how this all works. So this little clip goes through it, but the lock actually engages with this, I don't know, I've always called it the nugget. I don't know why, but I've called it that for a while. And this little clip goes through and pretty much traps it all. And the best way to load this is actually with it all out, like I have it right now. So kind of getting it started right here. And you got to get the clip in here. I'll show you how this works. I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, but I know a lot of people ask how these locks work, and they're kind of a mystery to a lot of people. So the clip's kind of hard to get in there. And it's obviously much easier when I have this thing that I like to call the nugget out. So go ahead and put the two clips. I'm kind of getting them in place as I'm pushing the thing down. Okay, there we go. So now that's ready to go. And the idea is, when we put the lock back in with fresh grease, just clips in like that. Now it's all locked. For right now, I'll leave it like that. But once you have the clip in there, the key will just go in one way. It's really, really hard to send that clip through otherwise, and obviously this would be on there too. So that's kind of the ins and outs of how the ignition lock works on the Vespa. So it's nearly a bare frame. It is possible to knock these bearing races out. They aren't included with the new frame. Perfect opportunity to put new ones in. You kind of need some special press tools to put those in. It is possible to do it with some really large sockets and some really big hammers as well. So keep that in mind. I still got the horn. I got several clips throughout on the body work I still need to remove, and the subframe. Sometimes I'll leave a lot of the stuff on the frame just like this, so when if I have a new frame, I know where all those clips are. You know, I didn't get too ahead of myself. But if you're sending out for body work, you know, you may not need to disassemble this part. Maybe only your cowls were damaged, so you just need to get it as far as removing the fuel tank. Maybe that's as far as you need to take it. But I'm doing the whole 9 yards. There's going to be several parts over the next 2 or 3 months, and eventually we'll have this all back together and be looking like a brand new Vespa again. All right, well, thanks for watching. I know that was a really long one, but I kind of showed you nearly everything you need to know on disassembling a Vespa GTS. And it pertains to pretty much all the different years. The later they get, the more complicated they are. They got more wiring, ABS pumps, to the very newest ones where there's tons of modules, just like a modern car. Just much, much more complicated and much more jam-packed with stuff. If you think this one was jam-packed, check out a new scooter. But sadly, if a Vespa goes down, you're going to need to do body work, and sometimes people are a little shocked of how much work it takes to restore a Vespa to like new condition. Mine's in pretty bad shape. I'm pretty excited to restore it, per se. I'll see you on the next one. Robot here from Scooter West and VespaMotorsport.com. And of course, if you need any of the parts for the scooter, we have almost everything on the shelf in stock at ScooterWest.com. Just go to ScooterWest.com, you'll find the parts. You'll probably find individual videos on several of the things I just did in this very long video. Thanks for hanging in there. We'll see you on the next one.